Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Gina, and I'll be your host for this session. It's time to get started with today's webinar on Newsfire's Q2 Threat Report findings. We'll be sharing combined insights on the current trends in cybercrime in partnership with Recorded Future. If you have any questions for today's presenters, please put them into the questions tab on the right side of your screen. I will collect them all and address them at the end. It is my great pleasure to introduce you to our speakers today, Josh Smith and Leah Cure. Josh is a cyber threat analyst at Newsfire who works closely in organizational threat landscapes, curating threat intelligence and authoring Newsfire's quarterly threat landscape report. Josh holds a bachelor's degree in cybersecurity and computer networking and is currently pursuing his master's degree in cybersecurity technology. Previously, he served with the U.S. Navy as an operations specialist with 14 years of experience. Josh has been quoted in Forbes, CSO Online, Channel Futures, Dark Reading, and others. Leah's background is in financial threat intelligence, cyber incidents response, and data loss prevention. At Recorded Future, a cybersecurity company that specializes in the collection, processing, analysis, and dissemination of threat intelligence, Leah focuses her research on major trends across the cybersecurity threat landscape, specifically trends within the malware and ransomware development and distribution. And now I will turn it over to Josh and Leah.
Thank you very much for the warm welcome. As we kind of take a look what we're going to cover here today, there's going to be a few different sections here. We're going to take a look at, first of all, our methodology and our overview of how we collect these data sets and how we process these things and what we do with them. We'll take a look then also at the actual data sets, looking from things from malware to botnet and to exploit activity. At the end of each one of those sections, we'll also talk about some proactive things you can do and how to mitigate against those things that we talk about. From there, we'll wrap up with some more recommendations and we'll open up the floor for a Q&A. So how do we create this report? First of all, we have to be able to acquire all that intelligence. We do that through all kinds of different sources. We use things like Recorded Future. We use different taxi feeds. We gather all this threat intelligence up, and then we pump that into things like our SIM and analytics and our algorithms to be able to utilize the ability to pull out trends and those anomalies and those weird things that pop out. From there, an analyst like myself gets involved. We take a look, we figure out, what does that mean? Are there global trends that match up with the things that we're seeing? While we do all those things too, we can use that information to build better alerting and detection capabilities. All of those alerting then goes into our SIM. Those rules are created, and that helps us stay up to date with the real trends and brand new things that are coming out to make sure that everybody's protected the best we can. And then through that also, we always go back and review everything and make sure that everything that's being alerted on is actionable, that it's not just noise that's going out there, and always working to improve our systems. So let's move into the meat here, the presentation. The first thing we're going to take a look at is malware activity. So based off of our Q2 activity, this was actually an increase compared to Q1. Activity was up by 41% when we take a look there at the total malware events compared against Q1. We saw over 1,000 unique variants, and that roughly breaks down to about 309,000 variants per week. So one of the things we specifically wanted to talk about here and call out was VBA agents. And the reason why for calling out VBA agents specifically is this activity actually had increased by about 269% when we compared the activity of these from previous quarters. Threat actors utilize these quite a bit. They've probably retooled likely since the disappearance of Emotet, and they're probably now utilizing things more like TrickBot and other malware families. These are the type of things that you see come into your mailbox that are usually the Microsoft Office documents, spreadsheets, those things that have those malicious macros in them, and they contain all these different types of lures. We saw specifically during Q1 Q2, a lot of information around COVID-19 vaccine information and things that trying to get people to interact with it and sign up. but ultimately, keep in mind that these VBA agents, these documents, these spreadsheets contain some form of a trending world event or some form of urgency behind them, like an unpaid invoice. Are then going to try to entice that user to enable the macros on it, which will then usually pull in another payload, some form of malicious things that may then end up launching ransomware.
Yeah, and along the lines of that, Josh, a lot of the themes that we see are with things that are happening around the world. So tax season, that's a big one that happens. The holiday season, we see a lot of phishing lures similar to that. And in recorded future data, the attack vector phishing increased throughout Q2, especially in May and June. And so we did see a decrease going into Q3, but this is a tactic that's going to continue and is a big one that's used from anyone from cyber criminals to nation state threat actors.
Absolutely. So another activity that we saw within malware that really jumped up was this JS Valkyr. If that's actually exactly how you say that, Valkyr. That's what I'm going to go with. But regardless, this is a JavaScript variant is what it is. It's similar to a VBA agent. It's another Trojan that's delivered via phishing in those malicious spam campaigns, except for this variant from using the Microsoft Office macros, it's using JavaScript, which typically you shouldn't be receiving in your mailbox. The same type of lures can be used within deployments, and the activity on this peaked by about 4,000% more. There's numerous advanced persistent threat groups out there, ransomware gangs, and things like that that utilize these types of phishing files. So as we take a look at a review total of the malware activity, I don't think it's really any surprise to anyone in the cybersecurity community, but phishing continues to be one of the most commonly utilized ways. And the reason why is because it works. If they can get that payload into a user's mailbox and entice them to interact with it, it will. It's something that consistently happens. So, because of that, they'll continue to do so, and it's very important for folks to be very mindful of those things. Also, threat actors will at times encrypt these payloads to try to bypass email security, so it doesn't look like it's a JavaScript file coming into your mailbox, but instead it's an encrypted file. They'll have a social engineering story built around it that'll include the password that you need to unlock that encrypted file, and then from there execute the payload. So as we look at additionally here, what can we do about this? One of the biggest things that we can do here is have some advanced endpoint detection and response. This goes beyond your basic antivirus that's just signature based. This is looking specifically at the behavior, what files are doing and what processes are they running. Should that file be reaching out to that and doing what it's doing? It goes beyond just having a known hash. Another thing we can do here too is segregate our networks. We want to make sure, especially our high-risk things like Internet of Things devices, those IP camera systems, those things that just kind of get plugged in and forgot about, are segregated from the rest of your internal network. If one of those things are compromised and the network is segregated, it minimizes the ability for the threat actor to be able to move anywhere without the network. And then cybersecurity awareness training is something I think that will be frequently beat on throughout this presentation, but I think it's something that's frequently overlooked, and it really should be something that is prioritized within organizations. It's at the end of the day, your end user is your final line of defense. If that thing does run all the way through their mailbox and reach them, do they know how to identify that malicious file, and also do they know how to properly report that throughout your infrastructure?
Yeah, you want to configure your IDS and your IPS, have those network defenses up to date, having external IP addresses that are known for communicating with malware, having those blocked. You want to configure your endpoint detection response platforms to alert and block on some of those connections, hashes, but also signature-based things like Josh was saying, using Yara rules, Sigma rules. At Recorded Future, we create those rules for our clients so that it's not just blocking on those hashes, like Josh said, but also looking for specific signatures within malware, so we can detect them based off of their behavior. And then at Recorder Future, we also have our API where we can import any malicious indicators into your endpoint detection and response systems to make sure that you're up to date, and any of those new indicators are being flagged and blocked or alerted on within your systems.
All right, so we're going to jump forward now into our botnet section. And as we take a look here, we detected over 40 unique botnets over Q2. And we also saw an increase in activity by about 50%. A lot of that activity came towards the end of the quarter. And this broke down to be roughly about a little over 6,000 infections per week. So one of the common botnets that we see kind of time and time again pop up is the Andromeda botnet. It's still one of the oldest botnets in operation, and it continues to be a prevalent threat. It's been disrupted previously, as far back as 2017, but it continues to make a comeback. The infrastructure keeps getting rebuilt, the threat actors move, and it's something that probably isn't going to go away anytime soon. The most commonly deployed method that they use is phishing campaigns, very similar and circles back to our previous section here again. And again, they're very known for using common world themes, the COVID-19 tax season, holiday season, all the different things like that. With that being said, activity did slowly start to decrease into Q2, but it'll likely come back up again as we move into Q3. Now, that big spike of activity we saw at the very end of Q2 was related to TorPig activity. TorPig's another botnet that's been around for a really long time. They utilize different Trojans and usually focus on stealing credentials, typically those ones specifically involving banking information. The activity had trailed off throughout Q1. But then Q2, the majority of it remained pretty quiet. And then at the very end, it spiked by about 1,800%. So a campaign from TorPig may have been launched near the very end of the quarter. So it'll be really interesting to see in Q3 if anything comes out from the cyber intelligence community that can confirm that there was an actual trend and where that focus of those things were directed to. So as we take a look at botnets overall, botnet activity, like I said, it had decreased out. I'm sorry, it had increased in general, but it appears to be leading into Q3 like it's coming back up. I would expect to see an increase again as we move into Q3, and a lot of this likely has to do with the Emotet shutdown. Emotet was very, very prevalent throughout Q1 and prior to that as well too, until their shutdown. In Q1, we'd reported after the announcement of the shutdown of Emotet, we saw all activity within, it was like a day or two, decreased by over 99%. So the botnet community, if you will, call them that, took a significant hit. And these threat actors that were utilizing these botnets to deploy their ransomware or piggybacking off their malware are likely scrambling to try to find new families to move into and new variants to work off of.
This is something that we're looking at kind of closely on our end because the botnet space is really interesting because Emotet was such a big player in this space. And then come Operation Ladybird, it shut down. And so we're seeing other botnets like TrickBot, IcedID, QuackBot, Dridex, and then BazarLoader come into the space. And in terms of our Recorder Future data, we found that TrickBot activity has kind of been the most consistent and most voluminous botnet family observed since that shutdown in terms of malware samples and infection traffic. And so TrickBot is a big player in the game, but we're also seeing BazarLoader kind of come in and have a big presence here as well. So I'm interested to see, we kind of talked about this a little in the last quarter update, but I'm interested to see how this evolves in the upcoming quarters, if we'll see new ones, come into the scene, or any of these really take off as the major player in that botnet space to take over that Emotet title.
And so if we move into the mitigation and response part for botnets, back again, like in the previous section, user awareness training, botnets are detected post-infection. So we need great threat intelligence to be able to know what that botnet command and control infrastructure is. So when the internal network reaches out to try to talk to one of those command and control infrastructures, we know that that's bad communication. That's a great indicator for an organization to need to focus on that particular device or that network to be able to identify what happened. How was there a gap in the cybersecurity plan to allow that infection to happen? So another thing that circles back to our antivirus and our EDR protection, we want to keep those things updated. We want to make sure that we're using that next gen to be able to try to prevent that infection from ever happening. And then also actively threat hunt within our environments. We want to make sure that just in case if there isn't a known signature or behavior, that you're still monitoring your things for abnormal activity. Observe your logs, put your stuff into a SIM and take a look and see, should my network be trying to communicate with, maybe a foreign nation that shouldn't be on there, or, any sort of that weird activity that you think your network shouldn't be doing. Those are pivot points to dig down into it in threat hunt to try to figure out and make sure everything is okay.
Yeah, the challenge with botnets is that they can change really easily. So they can change where they're reaching out to, those domains and IP addresses that they're communicating with. And so making sure you're taking all of these steps is really critical, because if you're just relying on indicators, then those are things that they can change very quickly, and they do change very frequently. So making sure that all of these steps are taken so that you have full security, multi-layered security on your end is really critical here.
Yeah. So as we shift over into the exploit section, we saw a decrease in activity overall compared against Q1, with a unique 390 exploits detected. This breaks down, though, still to a pretty large 1.6 million detected per week. So one of the things that really stood out and we saw a lot of activity in during Q2 was SMB brute forcing. We also saw a lot of SSH brute forcing during Q2 as well. So with that, brute forcing can be very easily done by threat actors, even your very low experienced threat actors too. There are numerous tools out there that you could go download right now that would allow these types of attacks to be performed. Fortunately, these types of attacks are very noisy, and alerting can be configured for things like that, of where you see a specific IP address attempting to do a lot of logins within a time period, or a specific username being attempted to be logged into, within a certain time frame. So things like that can give you a heads up that this type of attack is happening, and ultimately it should also give you insight to take a look and say, why is that port open? Why is that service exposed to the internet in the first place? Things like that really shouldn't be exposed, because as soon as they are, there's bots out there looking to try to attack that. And if a threat actor can find an exposed service, they're going to attack it, and they're going to attempt to gain access to a network from it.
Yeah, this is probably something, if you were to ask my friends and family, that I harp on a lot, is password security. This just shows, this is an example of how password security is so important. So we're constantly seeing advertisements on the dark web and underground forums for network access and compromised credentials. So like Citrix credentials, RDP access, etc. And so this is something that we're seeing really, really often. And we're also seeing compromises coming from this. So a big one was obviously Colonial Pipeline. That came from inactive VPN credentials that were used to gain network access. And according to the incident responders, those compromised credentials were likely found from the dark web or purchased from the dark web. And then really recently, in this past week, the UN confirmed that their systems were targeted by a cyber attack, and they believe that the UN credentials from an advertisement on the dark web were used to gain access. So that's why I harp on this a lot, but password reuse, password security, multi-factor authentication, especially for these types of systems, it's so incredibly important because if it's a password that's reused, maybe even from a personal account somewhere else to a corporate account, that can be a significant security gap and cause significant damage and disruption to organizations. So this is a big one I really, really push for that because it just causes a lot of damage.
So take a look at Q2 in review. Like I said, overall activity was actually less when compared against Q1, but it appears that trend has now shifted and exploit activity is back on the rise. There have been a lot of significant and critical CVEs, vulnerabilities that were announced during Q2 and even here early in Q3 now, focusing on many different technologies that are very commonly used, especially Microsoft products, Fortinet products, Pulse Secure. There's a lot of different vulnerabilities that have come out, and organizations need to make sure that they're tracking their technology stack and are subscribing to security vendor bulletins and things like that to stay on top of it.
In recent months, it's kind of felt like Microsoft has just gotten hit harder and harder and harder with all of these vulnerabilities. We saw all of the print vulnerabilities, Print Nightmare. There's the Serious Sam vulnerability that came out. We've already seen at least 2 ransomware variants actively exploiting the Print Spooler vulnerability. So these are constantly going to be coming out. Obviously, Windows is a big one because it's it's a service that's used across multiple organizations in corporate settings. And so using your vulnerability knowledge, prioritization of vulnerabilities, asset management is huge. Just understanding your assets on your systems and being able to use intelligence to figure out, what needs to be patched is really, really crucial.
So speaking of that, as we talk about mitigations specifically for exploits, we've both said it already, but it is definitely worth harping it again. Patch your systems. There is, like I said, it can be difficult at times to fully manage your tech stack. And I think one of the biggest and easiest ways to do so is most of these technology vendors have active security bulletins that you can subscribe to. They'll let you know as soon as they announce something. Usually it includes right with it all the different mitigations, workarounds, what version number is affected, what version number you need to move to, and all that. CISA is another great place to subscribe to because they often look at numerous technology stacks, and they're also looking at global trends and will release and let people know when a new threat actor is targeting a specific vulnerability or even a specific industry. Firewalls with an intrusion prevention system. I think that's something that's much more common nowadays than what previously was in cybersecurity, but it's still definitely worth mentioning and is still very important to have. These exploits can be detected if the signature is in place and stop it from getting through, even if there is an exposed service. I already just mentioned it, but we'll say it again. Monitor those security news, those vendor bulletins, and also monitoring the headlines of news and things like that. Then the cybersecurity community can also give you an idea. To be honest with you, too, a lot of times where I see some of the cutting edge stuff before it even hits news is social media, things like Reddit and Twitter, following other security researchers and things like that, and catching those things when they first talk about it before a major news headline picks it up. And as we talked about here too, with services, if it doesn't need to be exposed, make sure it's closed. And even if it does need to be exposed, put it behind a VPN or something like that. And then specifically, if you're not using a particular service on your network or within a server, disable it, turn it off. There's no reason for it to be on. It just adds more vulnerabilities or potential vulnerabilities to your infrastructure.
Yeah, Josh, you summed this up really well. I think just having an awareness of your assets, knowing what's on your system and within your network is really, really important here. And you can use threat intelligence to be aware and be on top of this type of thing with patching. But yeah, I think it can be something that feels overwhelming. But if you take certain steps like these, you can kind of get ahead of the issue because a lot of cyber attacks, the initial attack vector is from a compromised, unpatched exploit of a vulnerability. So yeah, this is a really, really important one here.
Yeah, and just to add one more thing onto that too, we see you talked about staying in front of it. The threat actors are also targeting old CVEs that are out there. One of the real popular ones is the Fortinet VPN, SSL VPN one, which I don't remember the entire nomenclature off the top of my head, but I know it's 2018 is when it came out, and that still remains one of the most prevalent globally that we see, being exploited. It's really important to patch your stuff because threat actors are looking for those folks basically who have set the bar at its absolute lowest. And often, in my opinion, unless you have some form of intellectual property that a threat actor is specifically looking to target from your organization, they're looking for the lowest hanging fruit to take advantage of. And if they rattle a doorknob, it's locked, they can't get into it, they're normally going to jump onto the next network and try it until they finally find that lowest hanging fruit that they can take advantage of.
Yeah.
So we'll shift over into talking about some ransomware stuff. We saw a significant spike in activity. This is actually the largest amount of ransomware activity we've seen here at Newsfire since we've started doing the quarterly threat reports. So right around week 2 or 3, that increase is roughly about 55,000% just within that short little time frame there. What's really interesting to me, and I can't fully attribute it to the DarkSide ransomware gang, but it appears to be, just a couple weeks prior to the Colonial Pipeline attack. And so it makes you wonder if there were some campaigns out there that were actively just being launched again, where they're looking for that low-hanging fruit I was just talking about, where they eventually found the Colonial Pipeline VPN access and then were able to launch an attack.
Ransomware was a big one this quarter, and it really continues to be. Like you said, we saw DarkSide on Colonial Pipeline, Conti ransomware on Ireland's national healthcare system, our Evil ransomware attack on JBS, and countless other organizations. And we're just seeing new ransomware operators pop up with extortion sites where they're advertising organizations' information and threatening them. And so this is a trend that is likely to continue. We're also seeing ransomware operators start targeting Linux systems, which is a new trend. And then from all of these really prominent ransomware operators that we're seeing with these really big attacks, we're also seeing them shut down. And so there's a really interesting trend that is happening here where there's this big spike in activity for these ransomware operators, and then all of a sudden they shut down. And this is likely coming from a number of different factors, one of which they don't want that government attention that kind of happened from the pipeline attack. So they want to kind of close their doors before they get that mainstream attention, which could cause them some pain. But then also what we think is happening here are that you kind of have to think about it in a human way. So ransomware operators, there are people behind this, and they work kind of like an organization. So there's the top level people who are those ransomware operators, and they often will allow people to use other cyber criminals to use that ransomware. So when ransomware gets really popular and cyber criminals are seeing that it's really effective, we see more and more and more cyber criminals using it. And so we kind of see this bubble happening, but then they shut it down because it's getting really popular. So this trend has continued with several groups. We've seen our Evil do it, DarkSide do it. And then we've also seen new ransomware operators come out of this. So Black Matter was one that we saw that kind of had aspects of DarkSide, our Evil, and Lockbit. So what's happening are these affiliates from all of these different ransomware groups help to contribute to different ransomware. So they do overlap a little, but we expect this trend to continue where we see a spike in activity, a shutdown, a new ransomware operator come up, a spike in activity, a shutdown. And this will likely continue to happen in the next couple of months. Unfortunately, ransomware isn't going anywhere, but that's why having all of these precautions that we've talked about all throughout the day or throughout this webinar are really crucial, because that's how a lot of these operators are targeting organizations, is through compromised credentials, exposed endpoints, phishing attacks, etc. So, Josh, anything else you want to add on to that?
No, not necessarily, other than I remember reading one of the reports from you guys that I found very interesting with the ransomware. You talked a little bit like the tier structure, but it's almost like a technical support center where they have like tier 1 operators, tier 2 operators, and those initial access folks, if they hit a road bump and can't get into a network, then they just escalate it up the chain, and they have developed, almost like an internal wiki on how to best perform these attacks with screenshots, and go into this tool, type this command. If it doesn't work, try this. And it's involved into their corporations almost at this point.
Yep.
And their service is ransomware.
Yep. It's a pretty wild space.
So as we take a look here, we've kind of beaten this at this point, but we're going to circle back through it because it really is that important. Next generation endpoint protection, getting beyond the signature based stuff to where, again, the endpoint can detect and see that the activity that's happening within it isn't normal. That Word document shouldn't be, launching a PowerShell script and things like that. It can detect that weird behavior and go ahead and either 1, block it, or 2, detect it and alert someone if that's how you decide to configure it. Patch your stuff. Cannot stress that enough, that you've got to stay in front of the herd and patch your things. End user awareness training. Again, we've talked about this multiple times, but that is your final line of defense, is when it lands into that user's mailbox and they say, what do I do with this? Again, I really think it's important for organizations to ensure they have proper reporting procedures within their organization that's established. So the solution for when something looks sketchy in their mailbox isn't leaning over to their coworker and saying, hey, what do you think about this? And there's actually an IT, security channel for them to report that up. And multi-factor authentication is another absolutely massive one. The majority of the research when I'm using Recorded Future and I'm looking at things like credential leaks, Leah had mentioned it earlier, but the majority of it isn't that credential was leaked from, your organization. It's usually because someone within the organization used their company corporate email on a service, whether it be a delivery service, whatever personal thing that they wanted to use, and then that got compromised. And if they use the same password on your network, which a lot of humans recycle those passwords, that now poses a very real risk to your organization. Something like multi-factor authentication could be the difference between being a headline or preventing a cybersecurity attack.
That was very well said.
Thank you.
Yeah, but yeah, I think all of these we've talked about throughout the day. I think another point here that I find very valuable is also in your end user awareness, doing some phishing exercises. That one is helpful for the end users to kind of understand that, I should be aware of this. I should be on my toes looking out for this. Here are some of the different types of lures that are being used. And when they accidentally do click on it or accidentally do open an attachment, it's a learning experience for the users, not necessarily a punishment for them, but they can understand, okay, this is why I shouldn't open it. That there was a typo here, or I should have hovered over the link. So I think that is a really, really good way to educate end users, especially those who find cybersecurity scary and daunting.
And I think that's another really important thing to say too, is for corporations, companies to foster a spirit of it being okay to learn about this stuff. And if you do, click a phishing test link, that person's not punished. It's open your eyes and help them learn to get better. Because at the end of the day, if someone does interact with a phishing link, they're not trying to be malicious. They're a victim at the end of the day, and they've been social engineered into being tricked into interacting with that.
Yeah.
So we'll wrap up here with some conclusions and recommendations. Try to make this one quick because we're going to kind of circle through it, and we're already running a little bit over on our time. Once again, end user awareness training. Make sure you have a defense in depth approach. There's no one single technology that's going to protect your organization. That's having the things from your end user awareness training, your threat intelligence, your firewall, your endpoint protection. Patch your tech stack. Make sure you're monitoring those security bulletins. Keep your malware protection updated. It's only as good as its last update. So if you're not keeping it updated, you won't get anything new from there, obviously. And then segregate your high risk devices. So in the event that you are compromised, it minimizes where that stuff can go. And we'll roll from there over into the Q&A, and I will turn it back over.
All right. Thank you both for a great discussion and sharing all your insights. If anyone has any questions, we will stay on for a few more minutes, and we urge anyone to stay around that if you have the time. I do see a question in the questions box from Landon. If you had to pick from one of these two, would security awareness training rate higher than multi-factor authentication?
So my personal opinion on that, I think it depends on the organization itself. And to me, also, security awareness training is kind of covering, they have some overlapping area, but they're also two separate things and kind of are two different mitigations. So your security awareness training is looking for something like phishing, and also, hey, don't reuse your password. And so the reuse the password part can kind of fall into MFA. As I dance around the question and circle back to it here now, if a company has the ability to fully implement multi-factor authentication, which can be a daunting challenge based on how many different technologies you have, I think I would go in that direction. But ultimately, security awareness training doesn't cost, it's one of the cheapest aspects of a cybersecurity platform, and it's very, very important. I would say an organization that has the capability of implementing multi-factor authentication everywhere likely could also do security awareness training. What do you think, Leah? Am I off on this?
No, I think you're accurate. I think I would put my money on MFA, just because I think that security awareness training is absolutely helpful, and you can involve password security within that. But I think that humans are going to be humans. And so there's going to be mistakes here and there. And there's going to be really good phishing lures and other tactics used to target people. And so if you can use MFA, and that's something that you can prioritize and make as a requirement across your organization a little bit easier, it will prevent those things from happening, even if you have a user who's very click friendly. So I think I would vote MFA just because that's something that you can make a policy out of, and a requirement for your users. So hopefully that helps.
Thanks, guys. That makes a lot of sense. Our next question reads for Josh. What do you think is one of the most easiest recommendations to implement for a small or medium-sized business who might not have a large cybersecurity budget?
This kind of circles into Landon's question is here too. But I think security awareness training, your cybersecurity awareness, especially for a small or medium business that may not have a massive budget to unroll all these different technologies, having your folks aware of that sketchy stuff coming into their mailbox, not reusing their passwords in different locations, using a password manager, things like that, those basic security awareness things can really help prevent a lot of different attacks from coming into your network.
Thank you, Josh. And one last question, unless anyone else has any questions. This one is for Leah. How does an organization plan to apply patching versus operational uptime?
Yeah, so we've kind of discussed this throughout the webinar, but patching can seem like a daunting task when there's just hundreds, thousands of vulnerabilities that are constantly being disclosed. So figuring out and prioritizing your patching is really crucial here. And there's several ways that you can do it. Josh had mentioned a few resources that you can use to keep track of what is being disclosed and what is being released. But even with all of that information coming at you, it can be very difficult. So understanding the vulnerabilities that are being disclosed, understanding, are they being exploited in the wild? Are there POCs out for these vulnerabilities already? That means it'll likely be exploited very soon. Is there broad scanning for these vulnerabilities occurring? Is the vulnerability easy to exploit? Is it a remote code execution vulnerability? Understanding the characteristics of the vulnerability and, the CVE rating, is it critical? Is it high, et cetera. So all of these characteristics of vulnerabilities are really important to understand. And using threat intelligence can really help you differentiate between vulnerabilities and understanding, what has some of those factors, or what's kind of getting blown up in the news, and maybe this isn't as big of a deal because it's just concept right now. So having that understanding, using threat intelligence, and using all of those factors together is a really good way to kind of take on vulnerability management.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Thank you, Leah. I don't see any other questions at this time. So if anyone does have any other questions, please feel free to email us at webinars@newspire.com or contact us through our website at newspire.com. Everyone will receive an email with the link to watch the recording of this session. And on behalf of Newspire, Recorded Future, and our presenters, thank you for joining us and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.